the introduction. Steve Kaplan, better known on Twitter as @ROI Dude. Over a period of 20 years, I started, ran, and ultimately sold 2 award-winning channel partner businesses. The first focused on Citrix and the second on VMware. And rather than use conventional sales methodologies, we would use financial analysis, ROI, TCO, to help our customers evaluate disruptive technologies like Citrix, like VMware. I considered Cisco UCS to be disruptive back in its day. And in fact, what you're looking at is the fall 2012 edition of Cisco's magazine. This is from the cover story, Getting Real with ROI, which was about the financial analysis work I did for Concentra Healthcare, headquartered in Dallas. And that's me in the center.
Very quickly, your screen isn't actually being shared right now. If you want to share your screen, sorry, sir. Just want to make sure that everyone gets the full effect and the full impact of
Yes, thank you.
And there you go, fantastic.
All right, thanks. So that's me in the center that you're now looking at, speaking with Suzanne Kosub, CIO of Concentra, headquartered in Dallas. And Suzanne had told me, Steve, for years we've been trying to get the monies we need to expand our small virtualization environment, our small VMware environment, but the most we can get is $15,000 to $20,000 at a time, not enough to even make a dent. So I worked with Suzanne's staff to put together a comprehensive ROI analysis that I thought had tremendous results. But Suzanne told me, Steve, we're owned by a private equity company with really stringent financial controls. We need more. So when Suzanne and I presented the results to the senior management and a couple members of the board, of course we went over the numbers. But what we emphasized was the fact that this big company, Concentra, was running on a backup generator. And the air conditioning was a total mess. It needed nearly $1 million overhaul. And with the hot Dallas summer months approaching and an ever-increasing demand for servers, that still would be certainly no guarantee they wouldn't suffer prolonged downtime. And if Suzanne were here, I think she'd tell you something like, that was an amazing meeting. After years of struggling to get money and drips and drabs, we essentially got the approval on the spot, verbal approval, for the millions of dollars we needed to virtualize our entire data center. After selling my second business, I moved up to Lake Tahoe, where I envisioned this cushy consulting career. But shortly after moving up, a friend of mine, a VMware VCDX, gave me a call and said, hey, Steve, I joined this hot startup. I think you could be a good fit. Come interview. Now, I wasn't interested in going to work for anybody. I just moved up to Lake Tahoe. But I met with the startup, and I was blown away when they showed me their technology. They had really taken the same model pioneered by Google in the public cloud space of extracting all the intelligence out of SANs and putting it into software running on commodity servers. And they brought that same model to the enterprise. And I'm thinking to myself, if this works for the enterprise, this would change the entire IT industry as we know it. But then I thought, you know, how often does a 50-person startup have even a prayer against the literal handful of global multi-billion-dollar giants that have completely dominated not only the data center for years, but as I knew full too well, the entire reseller channel. So I didn't join, but as I watched Nutanix's explosive growth over the next year, I began thinking, man, this company, this startup, they have a real chance of pulling off one of the business upsets of the decade. So I gave up my dream of a cushy consulting career, went back to work 70 hours a week at a startup. But you know, it's been this extraordinary opportunity to participate as Nutanix has certainly changed the industry. The technology it pioneered became known as hyperconverged infrastructure, HCI. Isaac talked about it in the keynote. It's not only a data center standard, but it's growing like crazy. And Nutanix itself has long since joined the billion-dollar ranks. Over the years, I've been very fortunate to co-author, along with senior technical architects, 5 books on Citrix and 3 on VMware. My co-authors all told me I wrote the easy parts, the business parts, which is probably true. Well, last year I came out with my first solo book, The ROI Story, a guide for IT leaders. Mark Templeton, the longtime CEO of Citrix, graciously wrote the foreword. And the book is geared toward helping IT professionals utilize the financial analysis framework, not only to evaluate disruptive technologies, but for those technologies that make sense to build a really compelling business case in order to help further gain organizational consensus and really importantly, to get the budget in order to bring those technologies in-house and to deploy them. Oh, Isaac, let's go ahead and, Jason, let's go ahead and run poll number 1.
So folks, you have a poll on your screen right now. If everyone can please participate in that, we'll leave this up for about 20, 30 seconds and let as many people get involved as possible. It is anonymous, don't worry about it. We'll just leave that running for another 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and let's share those results with folks.
All right, so this is a must has it with 10% saying who wants disruptive technology. Thank you. So in my book, I make the case that the legacy data center model, the SAN-based data center model is broken. And I give a lot of examples supporting that assertion. This is my favorite. This was a tweet by Mustafa Kali. Mustafa authored the book Storage Design and Implementation, vSphere 6, an excellent book. And he bragged that he fit all 1,242 pages in one volume. I mean, 1,242 pages. This is a big, thick, heavy book. Pre-pandemic, when I used to travel, I would lug it as a prop. Would take up over 1/4 of my suitcase. One time I had a TSA agent stop and search my suitcase because he didn't believe me when I told him that the big object in there was a book. Now, in contrast, the Nutanix equivalent to storage design and implementation in vSphere, because a little over half our customers run vSphere, is a 22-page tech note. So the 1,220-page delta represents all this complexity of SAN-based architecture, and of course, all the cost that's inevitably associated with that complexity. But even more concerning, it signifies an inflexibility, an inability for IT to rapidly deliver the innovative new services and offerings that the business is demanding for its customers. So let's look at some of the challenges of a proprietary SAN arrays from a financial perspective as shown by this chart. Let's say that, I don't know why anybody would buy a new SAN or array today, but let's say for whatever reason you have to try and guess what type of resource requirements you're going to have 5 years down the road, and then buy a SAN with enough excess capacity so that you can reach that 5-year part, assuming that's when the SAN is end of life. Otherwise, you're going to face a forklift upgrade that's really expensive and complex and time consuming. I mean, you're going to face it anyway, but at least you want to wait until the end of life 5 years down the road. So as the chart shows, you're buying all this excess capacity upfront, and of course you have to rack and power and cool that capacity too. And then since the SAN is proprietary, you just can't upgrade it with software. So, the whole thing starts depreciating the first day you put it in. And by the time that excess capacity is fully utilized 5 years down the road, assuming you make it that far, it's become really old technology in comparison to the newer stuff that's out there then. Now, the hyperconverged infrastructure, the HC model, turns this completely on its head. You can start with just a few nodes, in Nutanix's case, 3 nodes. Every leading storage manufacturer has one or more HCI offerings plus dozens of other manufacturers, and I'm sure there are other models out there. But with Nutanix, you can start with 3 nodes and then grow as quickly or as slowly as you want, maintaining this really linearity in terms of performance. In fact, it's really better than that, because as you're expanding your footprint, time's marching on, Moore's law is happening, technology is improving. So the hardware is getting faster, it's getting more capacity. What that translates to is your number of virtual machines per node continues to increase as you expand this out. So you look at the lower overall CapEx because of this as you're doing the financial modeling, along with the slashed OpEx. You're also slashing your administrative expense, because every single storage task and storage network task disappears. There's no LUN carving or switch zoning or RAID group management or volumes expansion. They all go away. So you add all these together and project it out over a number of years, and it tends to make a really stark contrast to the SAN-based architecture from a financial modeling perspective. When I joined Nutanix a little over 7.5 years ago, it was actually to start our channel partner program. In fact, we were very small back then. For the first couple of months until we started hiring like crazy, I was the channel partner program. But it didn't take too long for former clients of mine to notice my title change on LinkedIn and start calling me and say, you know, what is a Nutanix? And one of those was Bob Orkus, who had joined the year previously as CIO of FAIRWAY Independent Mortgage Company. And FAIRWAY in those days was much, much smaller than it is today, but it was still very fast growing. So fast, in fact, that the converged infrastructure system they had purchased just the year previously was already at capacity. They elected not to do a forklift upgrade. Instead, they're going to buy another CI system despite all the complexity that would entail. And Bob, you know, when I told Bob about Nutanix, he said, could you give me a TCO comparing buying that second CI system with buying hyperconverged infrastructure? And so that's what you're seeing here. Just like we still do today, we show the results on a cash flow basis year by year. In FAIRWAY's case, we looked at the cost of the hardware, the software. We looked at the planned expansion costs for both scenarios, especially because we're growing so fast. We looked at rack space, power, cooling. We took a really conservative approach to administrative savings, and we didn't even consider the business impact at all, something that's really big in our analyses today. But Bob was impressed enough with the projected $928,000 in savings. They took a gamble and was in a very young and small Nutanix, and of course a brand new type of HCI technology, brought it into FAIRWAY for a particular use case. Today, FAIRWAY is one of the top 3 largest private mortgage companies in the country, 40 billion in loan originations last year and growing way, way up today. And they run all of their applications on hundreds of HCI nodes. Public cloud, as we all know, has tremendous momentum. Since AWS essentially pioneered the concept in 2006, AWS alone now has over $11 billion in revenues last quarter alone. So you take, you know, all this momentum combined with the challenges of legacy SAN-based architecture, and again, the inability for IT to respond rapidly to the business requirements. You put this together, and there's a lot of pressure out there for organizations of all sizes to shift to public cloud. And frequently in my conversations with organizations across the globe, they'll tell me, you know, we have a cloud mandate, or they'll proudly say, we have a cloud first policy. And as an analyst, I like to take a step back and examine people's strategic decisions. So my question to everyone making this leap is simply why? You know, what research and analysis went into making this choice? And sometimes, you know, I'll hear answers like the CIO told us to do it, or the board thinks it's a good idea, or the most common one, we want to save money. But rarely are these reasonings backed by data or critical thinking about the most cloud smart decisions for the business. And predictable workloads, which happen to make up the majority of workloads for most organizations in public cloud, are expensive. The IDG Research State of the IT Modernization 2020 report says that nearly 7 in 10 organizations experience higher than expected cloud cost. This was echoed by the brand new Flexera 2020 State of the Cloud report that says 82% of organizations struggle with managing cloud spend, and they're over budget by an average of 23%. And you know, it's not a question of how smart you are to figure out the public cloud. Register ran an article earlier this year about NASA, obviously full of rocket scientists. And yet, when they negotiated their $65 million a year contract with AWS, they somehow didn't think about data egress, loading data back off of the website, off of the cloud. And so now they have $30 million a year on top of the $65 million a year contract that they negotiated and were expecting. And in addition to the high cost of predictable workloads in public cloud, running public cloud natively, there has a lot of other challenges as well. You know, there's performance challenges because you're running shared infrastructure. And a lot of times people are forced to upgrade to more expensive storage in order to mitigate that. There's resiliency issues, as a whole lot of organizations discovered last week in the big AWS East outage. There's you know, cloud migration. Just a few days ago, I heard about a CIO that wants to move all 14 of his data centers into the cloud over the next 5 years. My first question would be, have you prepared an analysis? Has the CFO seen just how much this is going to cost? But the second one is it really realistic to move all your applications to public cloud? Because there's just so much you have to do in terms of application refactoring, replatforming, and staff augmentation, and new staff skills, and new tools to learn, and so on. Security is a big thing. The skill sets you've developed internally for years or decades don't translate directly to public cloud. It requires new security skills. Again, the IDG report that I mentioned says that 49% of organizations in public cloud struggle with managing public cloud security. Flexera puts the number at 83%. And as an example of the challenge here, it's the big Capital One breach from last year. 100 million records breached, $80 million in outright fines, let alone all the other costs. And everything just stemmed from a misconfigured server. Public cloud can be extremely complex with invoices that run to dozens of pages, and again, the new tools to learn and so on. Isaac pointed this out about public cloud and the advantage of multi-cloud. A lot of people don't think about the risk of immobility into public cloud. You write to their APIs, you use their tool sets, and again, we're talking about public cloud native. And what happens if your cloud provider starts competing with you? Or if they miss their SLAs, or maybe they raise their prices a little bit, but it really impacts you negatively, or their security challenges, or on and on. It's very, very difficult to move to another cloud. And then finally, there are mundane issues like accounting rigidity, the inability to capitalize your public cloud contract costs. Tim Crawford, many of you know, strategic cloud advisor, strategic CIO advisor. In fact, he was the one who introduced me to Sync. I spoke at a Sync event almost 15 years ago now. But Tim tweeted earlier this year, when it comes to cloud migration, until that last workload leaves your on-prem data center, you're paying for your on-prem data center, and you're paying for the high cost rent of the public cloud. And then you're also paying for the IT staff to manage both environments. So as a result of all these concerns and the cost and so on, there's a lot of organizations coming back out of public cloud. IDC ran a huge study published mid last year of 2,211 enterprises in public cloud and found that 85% of them had repatriated one or more app back out of public cloud. And IDC projected that 56% of all applications in public cloud will come back out over the next 2 years. Last month, Nutanix came out with its third annual Enterprise Cloud Index. This is compiled by Vance and Bourne, the research organization. This time around, they surveyed 3,400 IT decision makers from across the globe, and they found that 86% of respondents consider hybrid cloud as their ideal operating model, and this echoes pretty much every other analyst report I've seen. Earlier this year, I wrote an article for Forbes talking about using a financial analysis, not just to design an optimal public cloud strategy, but also the much more complex and involved hybrid cloud strategy. Now, there's all kinds of different approaches. Isaac talked about some of them, like DevOps and so on, to enabling a multi-cloud environment. Nutanix is very recent. We recently came out with GA of Nutanix clusters, which essentially is taking Nutanix's on-prem HCI software and porting it to public cloud. Well, what it actually does is it abstracts the public cloud layer, and it also gives you all kinds of efficiencies that even though you're paying for the cluster software, you're reducing the cost of public cloud. And that was shown by this analysis we did for a customer recently. On the far right is the Nutanix clusters cost, both OpEx and CapEx. And on the far left was the legacy SAN-based, we call it 3-tier. And in this case, the Nutanix clusters was a little bit more than the 3-tier, was far less than the on-prem Nutanix. I mean, it was far more than the on-prem Nutanix, but it was millions less than two of the leading cloud providers. And Isaac, I think we're ready for another poll. This should be number 2, I think.
Yeah. Number 2. Do you want number 2, or do you want to jump to number 3, Steve? Did you want to just jump?
No, let's wait. We'll do 3 a little bit later.
Yeah, okay, let's do number 2. Okay, folks, another poll coming up. I do understand a couple of you can't see this, but for those who can, please do participate. Have you ever faced external pressure to move to public cloud? Your options are rarely, sometimes, or welcome to my life. So we'll just let this run for another 15 seconds. Allow as many people to participate as possible. Again, apologies for those who can't see it, but for those who can, we've got 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And we will end there and share the results. So there you go, Steve.
All right. Well, it looks like a yes. So you can also use financial analysis to help mitigate this pervasive status quo bias that is out there. And sometimes, I mean, let's say you're going to ask your IT staff to do a financial analysis. We're all human. Maybe somebody is getting close to retirement and he doesn't have to bring in a whole new disruptive technology to look at, or somebody else has years of deep relationships she's developed with their vendors, or somebody else has built her career around achieving legacy certifications. Now, she doesn't want to see all that go away. Naturally, when you have these kinds of concerns, if you're doing an informal type of financial analysis or technical analysis, you're likely to get, skewed results. But, and I believe this is certainly a big minority of IT folks, that the vast majority by far are curious about new technology. They want to learn about it. If it makes sense, they want to bring it into their organization, even if it's at their own discomfort. But even they are subject to what we call confirmation bias. And what that means is the prevalence of looking at and evaluating disruptive technology through the status quo lens of what we know. As an analogy, imagine we could go back in time 30 years and we see a would-be taxi passenger standing miserable in the rain, fruitlessly trying to hail a cab. And we go up to her and we say, in 30 years, there's going to be these new technologies, the internet and GPS and smartphone and ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft and Grab that will transform your transportation experience into something simple, predictable, and even pleasant. Well, she would probably lack the context to really understand what we're talking about. And in my decades of quantifying disruptive technologies, I see this happen again and again. In fact, in Nutanix's case, our case, we pioneered HCI 9 years ago, and yet we still commonly get questions from procurement folks, even from IT staff, professionals. What is your cost per gigabyte or per terabyte? Because that's how we measure storage. And if you're going to buy a SAN or an AS, it's a great metric, but it makes absolutely no sense in a hyper-converged world. Or take the whole virtualization lifecycle. When I started my VMware consultancy in early 2005, the most common question we would get from, or the most common objection we would get from IT professionals, you will never put my production server into a virtual machine. Now, we laugh about that today, right? And yet Gartner, who's in the business of projecting IT trends, saw what was happening years ago with virtualization in public cloud. And over 3.5 years ago, June of 2017, they retired their Magic Quadrant for virtualization. And today, every leading public and hybrid cloud provider, put Nutanix there, while we all support legacy standalone hypervisors, commercial hypervisors, for our own customers, we offer native Linux-based hypervisors that are integrated into our software-defined stacks. And they're so much simpler. There's no separate management tier to buy and set up and configure, and figure out how to make redundant and how to scale. There's no certifications required. They're resilient, they're scalable. So use a financial analysis to shed a spotlight on confirmation bias, to shed it on status quo bias, so that a formal report can be compiled, so that results can be delivered to the decision makers so that they can make the best evaluation for their organization, whatever that happens to be. At Nutanix, I oversee a team of global business analysts, and we help customers quantify disruptive technologies like hybrid cloud, public cloud, of course, Nutanix. We also have an initiative we call Project Superhero, and that's where we go to existing customers and help them quantify, how much money have you saved in hardware, software? How's it impacted your IT staff? How's it impacted your business? And one of those is San Mateo County. And their savings were around $11 million over 5 years. But I really like this quote from Eric Larson, head of infrastructure for the county. And he said, basically, in the sand-based architecture, life was drudgery, and we had to spend our weekends and nights doing upgrades and patching. He said, now, even though we've had a lot of staff attrition, we can do so much more, and we can do things that are really rewarding for us and for our careers, like getting into security, and of course, that are much better for the county. I mentioned FAIRWAY earlier. We did a look-back analysis for them, savings of over $10 million. But more significant, again, to me, the CIO spoke at Nutanix.next, our customer virtual conference in September, and he attributed, the hyperconverged infrastructure to being integral to enabling their, extraordinary growth over the years. Seattle Children's, we did a look-back analysis for them where we quantified their downtime, and we showed them that and we knew exactly what this was because they tracked it. In 2016, when they were running SAN-based and server-based, their downtime cost went from almost 30 million to essentially nothing. Nutanix's visionary CIO, Wendy Pfeiffer, says, relax about the technology, focus on the business. I couldn't agree more. And while my team is not always successful at this, we always strive to understand what are the business objectives, 4 or 5 years down the road, and then map those back to the IT initiatives, then ultimately back to the disruptive technology. And let's go, Jason, let's go for the final poll.
Okay, final poll. We're going to go for poll 3. Here we go, folks. So poll 3, for those of you who are able to see it, how aligns your IT staff with the business? We work in lockstep all the time. We try to provide appropriate feedback to their requests. We're still waiting to get introduced to the business. And we'll just let that run again for another 10 seconds here, guys. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's share those results. There you go.
The third one looks like it was just a joke, but I actually have had situations during my career where essentially IT never spoke to the business. That's kind of
we have a couple people here still in those positions there, Steve. There you go. Okay, done.
All right. When doing a financial analysis, I don't care if you work for the company that's getting the evaluation done, if you work for a manufacturer or a channel partner or a consultant or a research company, whoever it is, you got to be credible if you want them to seriously look at the results, and then if they make sense, bring the technology in-house. And to build that credibility, I encourage complete transparency so the formulas are easy to follow, all the numbers are supported, all the assumptions are laid out and supported as well. Make sure to at least address business outcomes. Scope is really important. When it comes to evaluating disruptive technologies, typically the larger the scope, the better they look. But on the downside, a larger scope means it's more key holders you have to get on board, key stakeholders, means more data you have to collect, it takes more time. So, it's a balancing act. And then over my, again, many years of doing this with disruptive technologies, I fairly commonly had IT folks, look at the results, say, man, these are too good. Nobody's going to believe these. And I don't believe it to be unethical to dial back the results if necessary. We want our champions, certainly in our case, to be able to stand before the CFO or the board and say, these numbers are real, they're conservative, there's no way we don't hit them. And finally, tell a story. In order to actually galvanize the decision makers to bring in this disruptive technology, a lot of times you want to hit them emotionally, like we did in the case with Consenter, where we talked about the entire company running on a backup generator and downtime being very likely. So numbers are extremely important, but tell a story, grab them emotionally to really get the impact of the financial analysis. And with that, let's open it up for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Greatly appreciated. Fantastic insights there. So I'm just going to stop sharing your screen and jump into some of this Q&A. So a lot of chatter going on in the chat box here as well, but let's kind of jump straight in. First question, so there's a couple of questions around Nutanix specific, which I'll hold back for the final piece here. But the first question will be, would you put all your eggs in one basket, question mark? Would you agree that a hybrid cloud is the way to go?
Well, I would say hybrid cloud is not putting all your eggs in one basket, right? Because if you do it right, you have cloud mobility, the ability to pick up and move your workloads to different public clouds, move them back on-prem. So as conditions change, as economics change, you have great flexibility. Putting all your eggs in a native cloud basket, you know, everything is situation dependent. You know, you got to do the analysis, but in general, I consider that definitely a much more risky approach.
Fair enough. Megan Clark asks, do you also include value chain analysis in your financial modeling?
You know, I guess the answer to there is it depends. If it's, you know, so we have to get our numbers when we do analysis, typically from IT or sometimes procurement, they're providing us the numbers. So if there is numbers that are germane to the analysis and they make sense and, you know, they're unique to one scenario and not to another scenario, then yes, we would absolutely try to include them. But you know, it all depends. And a lot of times, and I write about this in the book, you know, it's very difficult to just get numbers from IT, especially when it comes to status quo environment. They may not even know how many SANs they have and what models, let alone how much they cost. So what we do is we use, you know, kind of a negotiation tactic expounded by Professor Malhotra of Harvard. And we'll say, you know, you got this X brand SAN in your legacy environment that you have to upgrade. And we see that price for that usually go between 700,000 and $1 million. And you're kind of on the higher usage side. So how about if we put 850,000 down for a placeholder, and then, you know, we can always go back and change it. And we find that really effective because if you wait to get every single number, you know, the analysis never gets done. So we use these placeholders, and then, you know, if appropriate, we can always go back. The idea of a financial analysis is not to get a budget down to the dollar. It's to get enough information to make an order of magnitude decision about what's the best course for the organization.
Gotcha. Great. Tanwir makes a statement and asks a question in the same paragraph here. So I'll just kind of go through what Tanwir's mentioned. So Tanwir says 2 types of data center: hardware-defined legacy data center, and then there is software-defined modern data center. Broken hardware is killing and software is eating the world. Then why not cloud first, regardless of those known excessive costs? At least we can innovate much faster and at scale. Your comments, please, Steve.
Well, I would say, you know, a software-defined data center done right is cloud. I mean, it should be a private cloud or the on-prem part of a hybrid cloud. So, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. It's when there's this, you know, hype to lift and shift everything to public cloud without doing analysis. That's when organizations get into trouble because, again, you know, it is very expensive. Public cloud is very expensive. Even an abstraction layer like Nutanix clusters is going to typically be more expensive for predictable workloads than running them on a private cloud on-prem. But absolutely, you know, and I encourage people to look at cloud as an operating model, not as a destination. And when you think of it in that context, then it makes it a lot easier to plan and justify and strategize. Now it's just a question of different destinations for your cloud model to run.
Great. Another question here is, many companies are accelerating their shifts towards digital first models. What is your take on refocusing digital efforts toward changing customer expectations, and how would you calculate ROI?
That's a very good question. You know, at the end of my book, I talk about, the whole book was written from the context of IT as cost center, because that, in my experience, is almost always the way organizations look at IT. Even the ones that protest, that no, we look at it as an innovation center, but then they'll issue an RFP for new equipment or new software, which to me completely, you know, belies that statement of innovation center. So digital transformation dependent upon innovation. I personally feel that IT should be driving that, not just for IT, but for the entire organization. And absolutely, there will be new types of metrics required. And my second book is going to be titled The ROI of IT as Innovation Center, or my next book, I should say. And still in the early stages of gathering information and understanding what that entails. But just as an example, imagine that an organization through some type of IT mechanism, maybe it's a new ERP, maybe it's a digital change, whatever, they're able to do an acquisition that they couldn't do before that now doubles the market cap of the company. And, traditional ROI is not really going to cut it in measuring that type of transformation. So absolutely new approaches are going to be required. And my team and I are in the process of trying to figure out what those are.
Oh, just unmute myself there. Good stuff. So before I come to the 3 questions left, basically, the first of the 3 would be, what is an acceptable percentage of overall business cost for the IT budget?
Yeah, I definitely am not qualified to respond to that, and it varies all over the place, and it varies by industry. But where I commonly see, I would say, is falling to 2 to 3%. But if you're truly using IT as your innovation engine, and they're the ones that are leading the vanguard to shift, let's say, from a legacy way of doing business to a digital way, maybe 5 or 10% is appropriate, at least in the short term. Again, the most important thing to me is I don't know that the metric as a percentage of revenues is meaningful, other than maybe its comparison to other organizations in your industry. But by far the most important thing is just do the analysis. Again, like the CIO I mentioned that wants to consolidate 14 data centers into public cloud. Maybe he did the analysis. I'm not that involved with that, but I doubt it. My suspicion is, because I've seen it happen so many times, he went to the CEO and the board and said, we want to move everything over to cloud because they're going to be more agile and faster and so on, without any deep analysis of what the cost of that is and what the cost of alternative approaches would be.
Some agreement in the chat here. Yes, as innovation engine, that the IT expense should be higher, and people agree. If IT is a business essential, I would agree it should be higher than 5%. There you go. Okay, fantastic. Well, a couple of very candid questions coming straight out of you here as well from a couple of the attendees. So the first one is, what are Nutanix's security guarantees for PHI and PII data?
Yeah, I will say it one more time. Yeah, maybe I can guess.
What are Nutanix's security guarantees for PHI and PII data?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know the answers to that. I don't even know those terms.
No worries. Maybe Sylvia can elaborate further in the chat feature here. Another question, very candid. So how does Nutanix compare with AWS and Google?
Well, AWS is a big partner of Nutanix, and Microsoft is as well. That's coming up, and I'm sure Google will be there soon. So again, what we're using, their magnificent architectures they've built, and their infrastructures and their ability to scale instantly, hundreds of hosts if you need it, but we're abstracting the layer by running the software on top of those. And that abstraction, we find for most use cases, means that you can actually save money. Things like, the t-shirt sizes in a public cloud in terms of vCPU and memory you have to fit your instance into, your VM into. If there's a little bit left over, that goes to waste. You can't utilize that. But because our software is running on the bare metal instances in public cloud, we're actually able to use those extra resources. And on a per VM basis, who cares? But when you aggregate that across a whole bunch of VMs, it really adds up. And there's lots of other things like that, efficiencies that we bring to public cloud so that you can run in AWS, Azure, or Google, and you can move your applications that are much faster than you would normally, because you don't have to learn a whole new operating model and new tools and hire more IT staff and new security policies. So you can move very, very quickly, be up and running, and reducing your public cloud cost in the process.
There you go. Thank you very much. So going back to the previous question is, what are Nutanix's security guarantees for personal health information and personal identity information, PHI and PII?
Yeah, still, I don't know the answer to that, but if you want to send me, cap@nutanix.com, I will get back to you with people who know.
No worries. Well, one of our attendees here actually just kind of almost answered that for you as well, just saying she's used Nutanix and hybrid cloud in FERPA and HIPAA environments, which are far more strict than personal identity information. Nutanix was a great partner, so she's kind of done the question for you, but that would be fantastic.
Thank you.
And we do have space for one more question here. So it is a bit more security related as well. How would you introduce return on security investments, regardless of cloud or no cloud?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, security, what you're really doing is kind of like insurance, whatever you're putting in. And there are metrics out there that we can use for the cost of downtime. And sometimes customers like to track, like Seattle Children's, they track it on their own. We have lots and lots of studies showing how much we're able to reduce that downtime versus other types of solutions. And so you multiply all that out and you come out with an estimate. But it is, at the end of the day, it's not as hard to figure, looking forward anyway. Looking backwards, it is. But looking forward, it's not as hard. It's more like, what's this cost of insurance for this particular situation? But very important, I believe, to at least put attention on and try and figure it out, because it is such an important. The consequences can be so horrible if you do it wrong. and like the studies I mentioned earlier from both 2020 studies show that the number one concern of organizations is struggling in public cloud is struggling with security, followed very closely by cost.
Yes, well, that brings a lovely end to the session. So everyone will join me in a virtual round of applause for Steve. Thank you very much for your time, Steve. Extremely insightful.